Last time we gave our agent instructions files and its code started to match our conventions. So this time I'm going to give it an even bigger job to stand up an entire module. Um, now let's go ahead and give it the same instruction. I've got two instances of Claude CLI here. First, just kind of look at this again so we can get an idea of the application structure. So you can see we've got our place order module. It's got its domain objects. It's got its in-memory repository. We've got a shared kernel for our aggregate root. Same structure on either side, and we do have our instruction file here that's on both instances. Two copies of the same one. And there's a little bit of a difference there that we'll show you in a minute. But let's go ahead and start that. And we'll go ahead and switch these to auto mode. See what it comes up with. We'll let it spin here for a moment. You can already see, so we're starting to get some code changes on both. We'll have a look at the result here in a moment. Now, as that's running there, I should point out I'm not using any plugins. I'm not using any other options as well as that. And you can see in both cases, again, it didn't run the test. It created the test, but it didn't run the test because these aren't set up as full solutions. It's just some sample files here. So it took about a minute and a half for each one. And let's go ahead and take a look at what was created. So we'll come back up here to our code instances. And you can see in both cases, it's added a payments folder. So let's minimize our orders folder here and look at the differences between the payments. So again, here we've got an application, which has added a record payment on both sides. It's added interface. We've got our domain objects here, money and payment. Oh, we can start to see some differences there. It's got a money object over here, but not over here. Here we've got payment and payment status. And infrastructure, in-memory payment repository. So it did it the same way on both of those. You can see over here on this side, it's moved the money file to a shared kernel instead of creating another version of it here. So if we kind of look at that, you can see it's a sealed record money. Sealed record money. They look pretty much the same, but they've put them in different places. So if we come back up here to our orders, you can see the money was moved out of there. If I look at money here, you can see I've got money in both of those. So it's got a duplicate there. That may or may not be what you want to do. But you can see that there's a little bit of differences between the two. And in both cases, I mean, generally the convention is right, but the procedure that it went through isn't the same on both of those. So with the instruction files, it knows our rules, but it doesn't know what our playbook is. And that's what skills files are created to fix. So this time we're going to be enhancing what we did with instruction files, and we're going to be talking about skills files. So let's jump over here to our slides for a little bit. So the rules are not the same thing as our playbook. The instruction files, as it says here, the instruction files tell the agent what your standards are, but it doesn't tell it how to go about doing something. And that's really the limitation of where we left off with instruction files. They say the what, but they don't say the how. And anything which is complex or multi-step or which involves a lot of details, the agent will kind of fumble, flail around, and again, it'll come up with its own convention of how to do something instead of following what your convention is. And it may come up with a different solution every time that it runs, and it's not because it forgot what your conventions are, it's because it's improvising the sequence of getting to that convention each time. And it's the same problem that we had before when we were talking about instruction files, but it's kind of one level up from that. The unstated processes get guessed at, and those guesses can vary even in the same context from attempt to attempt. If I were to give it 3 or 4 different instructions for uh, with one of those versions, if I were to give it 3 or 4 instructions of creating different modules, it might come up with a different solution each time. And that's really what the problem is, where instruction files leave off, and that's where skills files come into play. So the idea of a skills file is that it's another markdown file. It's like instruction files, but it gives the agent a reusable step-by-step process for completing a single specific task. You think of it as a run book. It is written once and referenced repeatedly, and that's where that part as it matters to your context budget. Because we talk a lot about when you're dealing with AI, we have to talk a lot about context because you have to be careful, especially as the cost of AI keeps growing, and the budgets, that at one point seemed kind of almost unlimited for some developer environments, are getting scaled back quite a bit as companies um, have to cut back on these AI costs, and the amount of tokens that are used is directly related to the context, because context is essentially tokens. Um, so you can't put everything. You want the AI agent to have all these instructions on how to do things, but you can't include that with every single request. Because your context will bloat unimaginably and your costs will go way up. So again, that's where skills files comes in. It's because skills files, an instruction file gets sent with every single prompt. A skills file, on the contrary, is only sent when it is relevant to the request that is being made. Now, it might be directly related to a process that you want to implement, or it might be related to a specific subfolder in your application, a specific part of your code that you're working with. So skills files, are the place where you can be detailed and you can provide information that you wouldn't want to be included in your instructions files to be sent with every single request, because obviously it can grow fairly large and it's not relevant to the majority of the requests that you make. So you want it to be included only when it's needed. And again, that's where skills files comes in. And the difference is, as I'm kind of talking through these, as far as what you would put into each, with your instructions files, you're keeping it general. You got to remember that the instruction files is included in every single request. You want it to be generalized, so your standards, your patterns, your preferences, specific things that you want to do. Whereas a skills file, if you need to do something detailed, like how do I scaffold a new module, and provide it with those step-by-step instructions on how to do that, how you want it to do that, because obviously it can come up with any number of solutions on its own of how to do something. But if you want it to follow your process and your procedure and the way that you want it to be consistent, then you should be creating those skills files and giving it specific instructions on how you want it to do this particular task. When I want you to scaffold a new module, here are the steps that I want you to create. I want you to create these folders. I want you to create these code files. I want you to implement the tests in this certain way. However you want those step-by-step procedures to be done, that's what your skills files are for. And where they live at, that's actually one of the places where there's a lot of standards have formed around that. So you'll have a skills folder, and into that skills folder, you'll put subfolders for each skill. So you want one folder per skill. And you can, in each of those subfolders, you will have a skill markdown file. And that Markdown file will include the general information on what it needs to know about that skill, the step-by-step procedures, and if you need it to know additional specific details in certain circumstances, or if you want to have um, additional details, for various things, and not have it all in that skill file, you can create subfolders below that skill folder and put additional files into those. Generally, it's called a references file. But you can call it whatever you want, and you can break it down into several subfolders if you want to, for each thing that you want to do. However you want to break that down, you just put instructions into that skill markdown file telling it where to find that additional information. And these skills files can be global scoped, they can be project scoped. So you can put skills files up in your main folder, your main projects folder, and all you have to do is put instructions in the instruction file to tell your AI where to find those skill files. So generally the structure of a skill file is these 5 pieces. You'll have a trigger, when is the moment that you should be using the skill file. You'll have prerequisites. So a lot of times for these skills, you're going to need to have information that is passed into the AI. For scaffolding a new module, what do I need to know? What are my inputs? Is it a name? Is it it could be any number of things that is needed for that skill to be implemented. So what are the inputs? Then you'll list out the steps. First you do this, then you do this, then you do this, and so on and so forth until you get through all the various steps where you would implement that workflow. And then you need to tell it how to verify that it was completed correctly. So you provide those verification instructions. In order for this to be considered completed successfully, here is what you need to do to verify. Whether that's a build and run the tests and pass in these various information, whatever it is that you feel needs to be done to verify that, put those instructions in. And then an example output, a completed skill. When you complete the skill, this is what the final output should look like. Here's the folder structure. Here are the files that should have been created. Here is the functions that should have been in these particular files. That kind of thing. You provide it with a full sample of what the output would be. And here's an example of what you might put into a skills file. And it's obviously a very simplified version. And we'll look at a couple more examples when we get into the code piece here. But trigger anytime a new command or query is needed. Prerequisites. The module should already exist. In this particular case, here are the steps: step 1, step 2, step 3, in order to implement this particular skill. Verification checklist. And left off the example output, but this is at the very basic level. Here's what you would do. And this header up here is very important because this header is part of what is needed to tell the AI agent when it is appropriate to use this skill. So you need to have a name, you need to have a description, and that description needs to be clear. It should be concise, but it should be clear as to when this skill particularly gets implemented. And then in your instructions file, you would also need to put a reference as to when and where, when to use each skill and where to find that skill file. So you would add a skills section to your instructions file, and you would say, okay, the skills live in this folder. So you can put them wherever you want, but this this is where you tell it how to find the skills files. And then you tell it when to use each skill file. So before creating a new module, read this skill. So if I were to give a prompt, create a new module, create a new pricing module, like we did for our example here, it would say, okay, I've been asked to create a new module called pricing. So before I do that, I need to go out and read this scaffold-module skill. Before adding a new command or query, before raising a domain event, whatever it might be, you tell it when to implement those particular skills. So again, the key thing to remember here is the instruction file is knowing what the rules are, and the skills files are knowing how to implement those instructions, knowing how to implement those rules, knowing your playbook, as it says. You should always start small too. So, as you work with the AI agent and you're trying to figure out when it is appropriate to create and implement a skill, um, start small. Say, okay, here is an issue that I run into every single time. For instance, every single time I create a new module for my application, it does something different. When you recognize those patterns where the AI agent isn't consistently doing what you want it to do, that's when you start with the skills. So, pick two or three, start with that, and um, and implement those skills. So you can write your own, but there is also a vast library of skills out there. There are a number of um, websites out there that have huge libraries of skills that other people have created and have shared. So before you roll your own, you would want to go out and check out some of these libraries and see if there's a skill that's appropriate to what you're looking for, that is at least close enough. Obviously these are markdown files, you can edit them and change them. So if you find a skill file that gets you 90% of the way, but you want to make some tweaks to it, by all means implement that. Use that as a starting point. Save yourself that time. And as I say, grow by observation. Watch for those patterns when you're working with the AI where it does things differently every time, where you want it to be consistent, or where it makes the same mistake every time. It used to be, for instance, Claude used to be really bad with Entity Framework. It would do things differently every single time. It would do things wrong almost every single time. And so, that when I was starting my own journey working with skills, uh, that was the first thing that I was working on, is finding ways to get it to consistently do Entity Framework correctly. It's gotten a lot better over the years with the newer versions, Opus and Fable, but it used to be really, really bad at Entity Framework. So, I used a couple of skills, created a couple of skills around Entity Framework. And then again, just like with instructions files, these should be considered living, breathing documents. They need to evolve with the language. They need to evolve with the changes of your business patterns. You need to uh, review them regularly, at least every 6 months. And again, just like with instructions files, you need to treat them like code. Put them through a code review before you put them into work. Before you merge them into the project. Um, you know, get the feedback of your coworkers, your other team members, and do those code reviews on these skills files, so that maybe people might notice things that you didn't notice. All right, so we ran through some examples here, but let's look at the code. And here is the completed version with the skills file. So let's go back here first. Well, let's actually start with our instructions file. So it's a fairly standard instructions file. We've got our solution structure, we've got our architecture, we've got our coding conventions, we've got the test information, but there's this new section here called skills. So I'm telling it where to find the skills. So they're in the Claude skills folder, and saying, okay, read the relevant skill before starting the task, not after. Because sometimes you have to be very clear with AI. And I've got 3 skills that are laid out here, and saying, okay, before creating a new module, we're going to read this skill. Before creating a new command, do this skill. Before raising a domain event, read this skill. So let's go up here in our Claude folder and let's look at the actual skills here. So scaffold module. So you can see here, this is the first one that's in that list of skills files. You can see here that I've got a skill markdown file, and we can take a look at what it looks like here. So we've got our details. I've got our name. We've got a clear description of when to use this. So use when creating a new bounded context or feature module from scratch, and this applies to any new top level domain module. So we're being very clear on when the skill should be made use of. We've got a trigger. Use this skill when we're asked to create a new module. And you might think, well, okay, that's a little bit redundant based on the description. But this, they kind of serve 2 different purposes here. The description is kind of giving an index to the AI agent of when each skill applies, and then you've got an actual trigger here. So you may have um, 3 or 4 different scaffolding skills if you wanted to do something slightly different based on certain circumstances or the way that you ask it to do something. So you may have 3 or 4 uh, different skills that might have a similar description or close description, but then the trigger might be very specific. Okay, so when you have X, Y, and Z, do this particular trigger, or do this particular skill. When you have just Y and Z, do this, and that, so on and so forth here. So the trigger serves a slightly different purpose than the description up here. Then I've got my prerequisites. So say, okay, in order to create a new module, I need a module name. I need to have the aggregate root identified, and I need to know whether this needs its own persistence. And if you, with the prerequisites, when you give a prompt to the AI and you don't provide all the information that is needed by the prerequisites, that's when it will come back and say, hey, I've got a question about this. I've got a question about that. I need this particular piece of information, and so on and so forth. We've got our folder structure here. So saying, okay, when you create a new module, this is what the structure of that module will be. So, in our source, we're going to have a module folder. Under that, we're going to have a domain folder with an aggregate, potential events subfolder. We've got an application, and so on and so forth. So you're being very clear and specific in how that module should be structured in the code in creating the files. That's the kind of detail that you want to include in the skills files that you would not include in the instructions file. And again, because the instructions file is sent with every request regardless, but you only want to send this block of information when you're actually creating a new module. You don't want this to be included into every single request, otherwise your context will be massive and your costs will spiral. And then we've got the steps. First do this, create the aggregate root, then define the repository interface, then implement the repository, then add the first use case. So we're going over to adding our use cases, and again we're telling it to use a different skill. So you can have skills reference other skills, and that's key as well. And that that might be the difference between 2 different versions of a particular skill. If you say, okay, in this particular case, I want you to do use cases. In another case, I want it to do something else, whatever it might be. So you can have skills reference other skills. You also want to follow the pattern. So your references folder is where you might put instructions on how to do something. So if we look at our references folder here, you can see our application patterns. You can see here that this is referenced by the scaffold-module skill, saying, okay, our handlers should look like this, and our results should be this. And here's the various pieces that we'll add here. Here's the interfaces. Here's the tests that should be created around that. So in the references, because you want your skill folder, your skill file to be concise, just like all your markdown files. So you don't want to include all that information in here. So if there's a bunch of additional information that needs to be included as part of the handler convention, we include that elsewhere in a references folder. Do not reference another module's internals. Shared, if you're creating a shared type, it goes into shared kernel. And the last thing is to do unit tests. So maybe if you wanted to do test-driven development, you might have add unit tests as the first step. So it will create those. It will create everything in the order of the steps that you're providing here. So this order matters here on the steps. And then verification. So in order to verify that everything that is correct after you're done, run .NET build, run .NET test, ensure that both those are fine, with no warnings and all the tests pass. Make sure that there are no references from this module into another module's internals. Make sure that it implements iAggregate root. Make sure that there's at least one use case with tests. And then, the example output. When you're done creating that, it should look something like this. So it should have created a domain folder with a module, class file. It should have created a application folder with repository, and so on and so forth. With commands and handlers and all that implemented should match this pattern. And if you didn't come up with that as a result, then you need to redo it or fix that because you didn't do it right. So that's that. So it might be a simpler one. So for instance, let's add use case here. We've got our description, and this is just the steps for adding a use case. Again, we've got our trigger, our prerequisites, the steps to go through. You can even include sample code in the steps. So for a simple piece of code, putting it in line here in the steps is okay. If it was going to be something more complex, and this is kind of bordering on the edge of what I would put in line in the steps here, then if I needed a more complex piece of code as an example, then I would create a references folder and I would put it in a separate file. So say, okay, instead of saying follow the pattern in this block of code that I'm including, follow the pattern in this file and give it a link to that references file, or that file in the references folder. So yeah, putting inline code is fine, but again, if it's getting fairly complex, this is fine. This one, yeah, I think it's kind of borderline. If it was any bigger than that, I would say definitely put it into another file in the references folder and provide a direction to that. And then our third example here, the write domain event. Again, it's a fairly simple one. You can actually see this is the simplest of the three because it's only creating a couple files. There are fewer steps than that, but they all work the same way. You provide that information, and that is included as part of the context on a as needed basis and on a case-by-case basis. It's not included in every single request like the instructions files. So obviously, if you want to follow these specific patterns, but you want to keep your bloat down of your context, then the skills files, you can really start to see what the advantages of skills files are. So let's jump back over here to our last couple of slides to kind of talk through our takeaways here. So again, think of it as a handbook versus a runbook kind of thing. Your instructions files are your handbook. They have the rules. They provide the general high-level instructions, the 10,000-foot view, if you like, as opposed to the runbook, where is where your skills would lie, and they're on an as-needed basis, and they hold the specific details of how to implement these various procedures. Skills are only loaded on demand, so they're not included in every single request. They're only included when needed be. So it's important that your instructions on when to include those skills files are very clear and detailed enough so that the AI agent knows when those skills should be included. Include those 5 steps: the trigger, the prerequisites, the steps, the verification, and the example. You should include those every single time, because each of those pieces are needed as part of the skill in order to implement this skill. And then, again, start small. Pick 1 or 2 pain points and start with skills around those. And then as you find more pain points that cause you problems, then again, find additional skills or write additional skills around those particular pain points. So that's skills files and what they provide you that goes above and beyond what you would get from an instructions file, and it's important to know what the difference between the two are and when to use each one. So I thank you for your time, and I hope you find this useful. The next time we're going to be delving into MCP servers and going above and beyond what skills files are able to provide to your agents. And again, if you want to see the related blog post to this video, you can go out to our NimblePros blog and find it out there. Thank you for your time and have a good day.